along the way. Just enjoy the journey, the ups and downs to it, and just continue to stay dedicated. And when you find something that you love doing that much, just enjoy it every single time you get.
The notification sound on Caitlin Clark's phone, once a harmless chime of connection and support, had gradually transformed into something she dreaded, each ping carrying with it the potential for another message laced with hatred, threats, or vile words from strangers who had decided that her success somehow endangered their fragile sense of self. And the irony was bitter, that reaching the pinnacle of her dreams, the very thing she had worked towards since those long driveway nights in West Des Moines, could be twisted into a nightmare by the voices of faceless people hiding behind screens. And what unfolded during those months revealed the darkest side of sporting fame, a side rarely acknowledged in glossy interviews or highlight reels. Yet it also showcased the remarkable strength it takes to stand firm against a storm of hatred with grace rather than bitterness. But what the world didn't know, what even many of her closest teammates were unaware of, was that beneath Caitlin's composed public statements about the death threats and harassment lay a family story, a secret of love and resilience that would shape not only how she endured this crisis, but how an entire community came to see the power of unconditional love and unity in the face of darkness. The threats began innocently enough, buried in the avalanche of fan messages that poured into her social media after every game. But by December 2024, one man, Michael Lewis from Texas, had turned this constant stream into a campaign of harassment, sending sexually explicit messages and detailed death threats that made Caitlin's hands tremble whenever her phone lit up. She confessed to her mother, and during a late-night call from her Indianapolis apartment, whispering as if to contain the terror, "I can't even look at my phone anymore." And Anne's heart shattered because this was the same daughter who had charged fearlessly into defenders twice her size, who had never flinched under physical contact or the roar of hostile arenas. But this invasion of her safety, her peace, her humanity, was a threat unlike any she had prepared for. The public didn't know that this escalation began after a specific game against the Chicago Sky, when Caitlin committed a flagrant foul on Angel Reese, an aggressive but entirely routine play in the heat of professional competition, one that both players later brushed aside with mutual respect. Yet social media, ever hungry for drama, twisted it into a narrative of malice, igniting toxic fan wars that grew far beyond reality. And although Caitlin had answered calmly in the post-game interview, saying, "It was just a basketball play, nothing malicious. Angel and I respect each other," her grace under fire only seemed to deepen the obsession of men like Lewis, who interpreted her success, composure, and visibility as a personal affront to their worldview. The threats grew more specific, the language more disturbing, until the situation could no longer be ignored. What the cameras never showed was that Caitlin's father, Brent, had already been quietly coordinating with security experts and law enforcement for months, trying to protect his daughter, while allowing her to live as normally as possible. Yet Caitlin pushed back, saying, "Dad, I don't want to live in fear, but I also don't want to put anyone else at risk." And Brent, looking at her not as a national icon, but as the little girl who once stayed outside shooting hoops until the porch light came on, said thickly, "Sweetheart, your mom and I didn't raise you to back down from bullies, whether they're on the court or hiding behind a keyboard." What happened next surprised everyone, including Caitlin herself, for rather than retreating, rather than surrounding her with a wall of bodyguards and silence, the Clark family chose a path of quiet but radical defiance, led by a former educator who had always believed in the power of community, and reached out to other families whose children in sport had faced threats, unearthing a hidden network of parents, siblings, and friends who had endured similar pain in silence. And one evening around the dining table, with Caitlin's brothers Blake and Colin present, and declared, "We're not going to let hate win, but we're also not going to fight hate with hate. We're going to show them what real strength looks like." Their plan was deceptively simple. While they continued to report threats to authorities, they also began documenting every act of kindness, every encouraging message, every small moment of light that reached Caitlin, and for every vile message she received, they would share a story of love, a young fan's drawing, a heartfelt letter from a coach, a word of support from a fellow athlete, thus reframing the narrative from one of harassment to one of hope. What few people knew was that this idea had roots in something that happened years earlier, when a 16-year-old Caitlin experienced her first taste of online vitriol after a particularly dominant high school performance, and she had run in tears to her grandmother, Rita, sobbing, "I don't understand why people hate me for playing basketball," and Rita, with hands weathered by time and wisdom, cupped her granddaughter's face and said, "Hate is loud, my dear, but love is stronger, even when it whispers. Don't let the noise of hate drown out the quiet truth of who you are." Those words, carried in Caitlin's memory, became the spiritual foundation of what the family was now attempting on a larger scale, and as the weeks passed, this approach began to resonate beyond their circle, with fans and strangers alike joining the movement by sending stories of kindness, standing together to drown out cruelty with compassion. For Caitlin, the darkest months of her career became paradoxically the beginning of something transformative, for though the harassment had wounded her deeply, the love that surged in response reminded her that she was not alone, that her identity was not confined to how strangers perceived her, but defined by the community that truly knew and cherished her. And in time, what began as a survival mechanism evolved into something greater, a campaign against online harassment in sports, built on the principle that hate could never be fully eradicated, but it could be overwhelmed by the louder, steadier force of love. And in this way, the family's secret, that quiet, stubborn insistence on responding to darkness with light, inherited from Rita and carried forward by and Brent and Caitlin herself, became not only the anchor that saved Caitlin from drowning in fear, but also a beacon for others who found themselves in similar storms, proving that even in an age where cruelty can travel at the speed of a notification, unconditional love
for the rookie. If it's not there, getting much more confident kicking it out and trusting our guards are going to get it back in. Becker's getting inside.
The words of her grandmother had never left Caitlin Clark's heart, echoing through the chambers of her memory like a steady drumbeat reminding her of her responsibility not only to herself, but to the countless others who looked up to her. And when Rita Clark had told her years ago, "Baby girl, some people's hearts are so small that your light makes them feel dark inside, but that's not your problem to fix. Your job is to keep shining and let your light help other people find their own." Caitlin had not fully grasped the depth of that wisdom, though she carried it with her through her college triumphs, her record-breaking nights, her struggles with fatigue and expectation, her WNBA debut, and even through the darkest storms of harassment that threatened not only her peace of mind, but her very sense of safety. And yet it wasn't until the Lewis case reached its devastating peak that those words revealed their full weight. For one can perceive that sometimes the greatest trials come not on the field of play, not against defenders lunging for the ball, but against faceless hatred hurled from shadows by people who have never met you, people who, for reasons rooted in fear, insecurity, prejudice, or bitterness, decide that your success, your visibility, and your courage are affronts to the fragile walls they have built around themselves to feel powerful. And when Michael Lewis, a man from Texas she had never encountered in her life, was finally arrested and charged with stalking and harassment, it marked both a grim conclusion to months of dread and the fragile beginning of something that would transcend the narrow boundaries of sports. Because as Caitlin sat in the courthouse listening to the prosecutor lay bare the chilling details of the threats and the terror they inflicted, she felt a subtle but undeniable shift within her being, as though the suffocating weight of fear was finally transforming into something lighter, sharper, more purposeful. And when the prosecutor declared, "Your Honor, Ms. Clark felt terrorized, frightened, intimidated, and threatened by Mr. Lewis's actions. But what's remarkable is how she and her family have chosen to respond." The words rang true, but omitted the most extraordinary element of all. The private conversation the night before, when Caitlin had told her parents with a newfound firmness that she wanted to speak for herself, not just about what had been done to her, but about what she intended to do differently, moving forward. And so the next day, in a courtroom brimming with family, teammates, coaches, journalists, and strangers whose lives were tethered to hers in that moment, she rose with hands steady, voice unwavering, and met the gaze of the man who had sought to break her spirit, declaring, "What you did was wrong. You tried to make me afraid to be successful. afraid to be visible, afraid to be myself. But you failed. And then, sweeping her eyes over the sea of faces behind her, she added with a conviction forged in both pain and resilience. Because what you didn't understand is that I am not alone. I have a family who taught me that love is stronger than hate. I have a community that believes in lifting each other up instead of tearing each other down. And I have a platform I will use to ensure other young athletes know they don't have to endure this kind of hatred alone. The ripples of that statement were immediate and immense, spreading far beyond the wood-paneled walls of the courtroom into living rooms, locker rooms, and online forums where athletes and fans alike began to share their own stories of harassment and the hidden toll of toxic sports culture. And within days, parents had begun forming support groups to protect and comfort young athletes. Coaches had stepped forward to pledge safer environments. And the WNBA, prompted by the urgency of Caitlyn's ordeal, announced new protective measures for its players. Yet the most remarkable development was Caitlyn's refusal to let her harasser's punishment be the central victory. For when Michael Lewis was sentenced to nearly 2.5 years in prison, she did not revel in his downfall, but instead redirected the spotlight towards something more enduring and luminous, announcing the creation of the Light Over Darkness Foundation, a beacon for young athletes facing harassment, and a program designed to teach communities how to meet hate not with retaliation but with compassion, solidarity, and education. And in her launch speech, she invoked her grandmother's timeless guidance, saying, "Grandma Rita always told me that my job was to keep shining and help others find their light. And this foundation is how we are going to do that." And true to her word, the very first recipient of its support was a teenage basketball player in Texas who had been receiving threats eerily similar to Caitlyn's. And when Caitlyn phoned the girl personally, the young athlete broke down in sobs of relief, confessing that she had felt utterly alone and was on the verge of quitting the sport she loved. To which Caitlyn, recalling her own trembling nights, softly but firmly said, "You're not alone, and you're definitely not quitting. We will get through this together." 6 months later, when Caitlyn opened a letter that left her weeping in silence by the warm glow of a setting sun, she discovered it was from Lewis's own sister, who apologized for her brother's actions and thanked Caitlyn for choosing grace over vengeance, writing, "You could have destroyed him, but instead you built something beautiful, and that is the kind of person I want my children to become." And those words, so unexpected, so raw in their honesty, brought her back once more to her grandmother's philosophy that the true measure of a person lies not in how they handle their victories or defeats, but in how they treat those who have harmed them. And Caitlyn understood in that instant that while the threats and harassment